The stone of the floor is cold against the soles of the feet. In the dark, the fingers find the rough wool of the tunic and pull it over the head. The knees hit the hearthstone with a dull thud. There is the scrape of flint, the smell of charred cloth, and the small, fragile warmth of a growing spark. This is the first movement, performed before the sun or the bell, repeated until the hands do not need light to find their way. The fire catches. It casts a thin orange light across the room, reaching the edges of the heavy wooden table and the water pail by the door. The weight of the wooden yoke settles onto the shoulders. The path to the well is frozen, the mud hardened into sharp ridges that press through thin leather. At the well, the rope is wet and stiff. It bites into the palms as the bucket rises. The water splashes against the side, a cold shock against the skin, but the grip does not loosen. This weight is carried back. It is poured into the pot. It is the same weight carried yesterday, and the weight that will be carried when the frost turns to rain. Inside, the hearth is gaining strength. The air begins to smell of wood smoke and damp wool. A handful of dried herbs is dropped into the water. The porridge is stirred with a heavy spoon, the arm moving in a slow, steady circle. The wood of the spoon is worn smooth in the center, shaped by the grip of hands that have moved this way for years. There is no sound yet from the village, only the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scrape of the spoon against the pot. The children stir in the straw, their breath visible in the air. The light at the window is a pale, bruised gray. The fire must be tended. The water must be heated. The floor must be swept. These actions follow one another without a gap. There is no pause to consider the work, only the transition from one task to the next. The knowledge of what comes next is not in the mind, but in the muscles of the back and the joints of the fingers. The light grows. It touches the tools leaning against the wall and the grain sack in the corner. The village begins to breathe. A door creaks nearby. A dog barks in the distance. The morning has not yet begun for the men, but the house is already warm. The sun breaks the horizon, a thin line of gold through the doorway. The first stage of the labor is complete. The hands are wiped on the apron, and the body turns toward the next requirement. This is how the day is built, one movement at a time, before the world has a name for it. The dough is heavy. It resists the press of the palms, a thick mass of flour and water that requires the full weight of the body to move. The arms push forward, the heels of the hands sink deep into the center, and the shoulders lean into the effort. This resistance is the first fact of the morning. Each fold of the dough is a deliberate act, a slow repetition that warms the skin despite the draft from the door. The texture changes under the fingers, shifting from a sticky grit to a smooth, elastic tension. The smell is of damp grain and the sour life of the starter. It is a constant scent, ingrained in the grain of the wooden kneading trough and the skin of the forearms. The loaves are shaped and set aside. They sit under a linen cloth, waiting for the communal oven to reach its heat. There is no measurement by numbers, only the feel of the air and the spring of the dough when pressed by a thumb. The work shifts to the dairy. The wooden churn is tall, the dasher a heavy limb that must be moved up and down without breaking the rhythm. The cream inside is thick, dragging against the wood. The sound is a dull, wet thud that echoes in the small space. After a time, the shoulders begin to ache, a steady throb that matches the beat of the dasher. The rhythm does not change. To slow is to lose the break. The cream must be turned into butter while the temperature is right. When the grain of the butter finally separates, the hands reach into the cold buttermilk. They gather the yellow clumps, squeezing out the liquid, pressing the fats into a solid block. The water used to rinse the butter is pulled from the well, numbing the fingers until they are a dull red. The vegetable plot waits outside. The earth is packed and requires the short hoe to break the crust around the leeks and cabbages. The back remains bent. The eyes stay on the soil, looking for the pale green of a weed or the trail of a slug. The sun is higher now, but the heat does not reach the marrow. Scarcity is managed in small movements. A handful of oats is saved. A withered apple is trimmed of its rot and kept for the pot. The mind calculates the depth of the grain sack by the weight of the scoop. The hands know what is left by the way the palm brushes the bottom of the bin. Survival is not a thought, but a series of physical balances. The afternoon light flattens against the dairy wall. The butter is salted and stored. The bread is fetched from the oven, the crusts hard and smelling of fire. The weight of the finished loaves is the weight of the week's security. The arms are tired, but the shelves are not empty. The day has moved from the dark of the hearth to the fullness of the larder, and the body prepares for the hours that remain. The spindle turns. It is a small, weighted stone at the end of a wooden shaft, pulling the raw wool into a single, unending thread. The fingers of the left hand pull the fibers from the distaff, while the right hand gives the flick that keeps the motion alive. The snap of the twist is the only sound. The thread grows longer, winding around the wood before the process begins again. This is the work that fills the gaps between all other work. It is done while sitting by the fire, while standing at the threshold, and while walking to the neighbors. The feet do not move, but the hands never rest. The middle of the day brings no change in pace, only a change in the weight of the air. The laundry is taken to the stream. The water is fast and gray, pulling at the heavy linen tunics. The fabric becomes a sodden, leaden mass when wet. It must be beaten against the flat rocks with a wooden bat. Each strike sends a spray of cold water against the face. The shoulders absorb the shock of wood hitting wet cloth, a dull jarring that settles into the joints. Time is not marked by a clock, but by the drying of the wool or the slow movement of the shadow across the courtyard. The children are near. They crawl in the dirt or sit by the washtub, their needs met without a pause in the labor. A hand reaches out to steady a stumbling child, while the other continues to scrub. The two tasks are not separate. They are one continuous motion of the body. The mending follows. The needle is bone or iron, passing through thick weave. The eyes strain in the shifting light of the afternoon. A tear in a sleeve is closed. A thinning heel of a sock is reinforced. Each stitch is a small defense against the wear of the world. The back remains curved, the neck stiffening as the sun begins its slow descent behind the trees. Fatigue is a settled thing. It is not a sharp pain, but a heavy layer that covers the limbs like a second skin. It is accepted. To stop is to let the thread break or the fire die. The repetition provides its own kind of momentum, a steady pulse that carries the work forward even when the mind is blank. The light begins to turn a deeper gold, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. The spinning continues. The thread is thin, but it is strong enough to hold the weight of the day. The transition from light to dusk is almost invisible, marked only by the hands moving closer to the flickering light of the hearth. The transition from the house to the field is marked by the weight of the sickle. It is a curved blade, short and serrated, designed for a body that stays close to the ground. The leather of the boots sinks into the damp earth of the communal strips. The labor of the harvest does not distinguish between those who own the land and those who work it. The spine bends at the waist. One hand grasps a handful of stalks, feeling the dry rasp of the wheat against the palm, while the other draws the blade through the base. The sound is a rhythmic hush hush, repeated 1,000 times until the ears no longer hear it. The sun is a weight on the back of the neck. There is no shade in the open strips. The sweat runs in thin lines through the dust on the skin, but the pace does not falter. To leave the grain in the field is to invite the rot of the rain. The women move in a line, their movements synchronized by the necessity of the task. Behind them, the bundles are tied with twists of straw, the rough fibers catching on the skin. In the corners of the field, after the main reaping is done, the work of gleaning begins. This is the search for what remains. The eyes scan the stubble for a dropped ear of grain, a stray stalk that escaped the blade. It is slow work. It requires constant stooping, a slow crawl across the broken earth. Each grain found is a minute addition to the winter store, a tiny defiance against the coming cold. The animals must also be tended. The pigs are driven into the woods to find mast. The cows are led to the fallow pasture. There is the steady pull of the lead rope and the physical strength required to manage a beast that weighs 5 times as much as the person leading it. The knowledge of the animal's temperament is held in the tension of the grip and the tone of the voice. The record of the manor lists the bushels gathered and the tithes paid. It names the men who hold the land and the silver owed for the season's grace. It does not name the hands that swung the sickle or the backs that carried the bundles to the cart. The labor is woven into the yield itself, invisible once the grain is threshed and the straw is stacked. As the sun begins to dip, the tools are gathered. The blade of the sickle is wiped clean of sap and grit. The walk back to the village is slower than the walk out, the legs heavy with the memory of the field. The threshold of the house is crossed again, but the work of the field is simply replaced by the work of the hearth. The door is pulled shut against the rising damp of the evening. The light of the sky has faded to a deep, bruised purple, but the interior of the house remains a place of movement. The fire, which had been reduced to white ash and glowing embers, is fed again. The wood catches, and the shadows of the room stretch and dance against the wattle and daub walls. The evening meal is not a moment of rest, but a shift in the nature of the effort. The heavy iron pot is swung over the heat. The smell of stewed leeks and coarse grain fills the small space. There is the sound of wooden bowls being set upon the table, a rhythmic, hollow clicking. The body moves with a stiff, practiced grace, the ache in the lower back becoming a dull, familiar presence that no longer requires attention. When the meal is finished, the labor continues in the dim light of a tallow candle or the hearth's glow. A strap of leather has perished and must be stitched. A wooden tool handle has splintered and needs to be smoothed with a shard of stone. These are the repairs of survival. The hands, stained by the soil of the fields and the grease of the wool, move with a precision that does not falter in the shadows. The children are settled into the straw. Their breathing slows, becoming deep and regular. The house grows quiet, yet the spindle is taken up once more. The flick of the wrist and the whir of the stone whorl persists. This is the time of the long vigil, where the work is quiet and the mind is held in the steady loop of the task. The weight of the day's fatigue is at its heaviest now. It presses behind the eyes and pulls at the shoulders. There is no space for reflection on the hardship, only the physical recognition of what has been accomplished and what remains for the morning. The wood for the first fire of the next day is laid out by the hearth. The water pail is checked. The rhythm of the household is maintained through the sheer persistence of the body. The candle gutters. The last of the thread is wound. The fire is banked with ash to keep the heart of the flame alive until the dawn. The wool is set aside, and the heavy tunic is finally removed.
The transition to sleep is abrupt, a sinking into the straw that is less a choice and more a surrender to the gravity of the day's labor. The house is still. Outside, the village is a collection of dark shapes under a cold sky. The work has not ended, it has merely paused, held in the quiet tension of the banked fire and the waiting tools.
The village endures. The stone walls of the church and the timber frames of the houses stand against the seasons, but the force that holds them together is not found in the ledgers of the lords. It is found in the silence of the morning and the repetition of the evening. The names of those who governed are carved into stone or inked onto parchment. The names of those who rose before the bell are not. Their history is written in the smoothed wood of a spoon, the hollowed center of a hearthstone, and the persistent fertility of a garden plot. It is a record of physical presence, an accumulation of small acts that allowed the next day to begin. The labor was the environment itself. It was as constant as the rain and as certain as the turning of the earth. When a wall was mended or a child was fed, the world remained stable. This stability was bought with the skin of the palms and the strength of the spine. It was work without witness, performed not for the sake of memory, but for the necessity of the hour. The village changed, new roofs replaced the old, the fields were redivided, yet the pattern of the hands remained. The way a girl watched her mother turn the cream was the same way her own daughter would watch her. This knowledge was passed through the eyes and the muscles, a silent inheritance that required no words and left no signature. To look at the landscape is to see the result of this endurance. The paths worn into the hillsides were shaped by the feet of those carrying water and wood. The clarity of the stream was maintained by those who washed the linen. The survival of the community was not a single event, but a million repetitions of the same essential gestures. The fire is banked once more. The tools lean against the wall, ready for the touch of hands that will find them in the dark. The story of the day is not told in words, but in the exhaustion of the body and the readiness of the hearth. The weight of the silence is heavy, but it is not empty. It is filled with the presence of all the days that came before. The unseen hands have finished their work for now, leaving the world exactly as it needs to be for the sun to rise and the cycle to begin again.
Thank you for tuning in today's story. If you really enjoyed the story, kindly share it with your friends and subscribe to this channel for more medieval stories coming your way. See you in our next story.